Afternoon. Welcome to Creating Zola Mondays. We're so happy that we were able to join you. We're having some technical difficulties, and it looks like we're recording this, so we're happy about that as well. So happy to see you, uh, or at least to know you're there this afternoon. And we are going to have a kind of a shift in our programming today because, as you know, we've had some fabulous experts over the last several weeks from uh, Dr. Bynum to Dr. Jennings to Dr. Nobles. So today I thought what we would do is to just touch in and see what's going on with our panelists and get their thoughts about what's going on in the society and the world today. As you know, we've been through a lot. I don't know if you all are news watchers. Hopefully not. It's probably depressing if you are. But just seeing all that's been happening, this whole celebration of the 100th year of Tulsa, Oklahoma, to say nothing of the continued murders of Black men and women and children by police with impunity. And so, what we thought we would do today is to talk about the seasons of challenges, lessons learned from the seasons of challenges, because we've been through a long season of challenges, both collectively and in some instances personally. So, what I want to do today, or what we want to do today, is kind of talk about what people are thinking and share what we've learned, what our lessons have taught us during this particular season. And I think I'd like to start by just getting some sense of how our panelists feel about what's been happening. What do they see? What do they experience? What are their friends saying, their colleagues?
So do you want to call on somebody or do you want us to just talk?
Jump in, but I can call on you, Dr. Lindner, Elder Lindner.
I realize that um, um, a lot of times I'm not um, in touch with my feelings as the people around because I've spent a lot of time turning myself into an observer. And so a lot of time I kind of watch what's going on and I think about what's going on and I feel less. Um, so it has its advantages and disadvantages. But what I think is that a lot of things that are happening right now are happening because they need to happen to get our attention, to get us to begin to think about what are we doing wrong? You know, what could we be doing different? You know, what is it in our actions or inactions that lead to the things that we see in the society around us? And so many of us are attuned, we've been acculturated to the notion that when bad things happen, it's somebody else's fault. Um, and I think that one of the reasons we do these discussions on creating Zola Mondays, one of the reasons we do these discussions is to get us to tune into a level of consciousness that helps us ask different questions than we've asked before. And the question I ask myself is not what's wrong with those people and why are they doing the things that they're doing? But what I ask myself is like, what is it about us? Why do we do these things to ourselves? And that's a different, it's a different twist to the question for most of us who are concerned about social justice and concerned about racism and oppression and all that, is to be able to ask that question with a we in it instead of a they in it. And so I'll start with that and throw that out and let people ponder on that chew on it for a few minutes, and then we can come back to that notion if people want to later.
You know, one of the things that pops in my mind, just hearing you having said that, being a child of the 70s, Marvin sang about what's going on for a very long time. It's still with us today. And so, we kind of grew up pondering what's going on. And I don't know if it was as a detached observer as much, but definitely as an observer and trying to figure things out. And so we've had, decades of having the opportunity to kind of raise these questions in this kind of way. So I'm wondering what our younger generations are thinking and experiencing? Garrick or Robina?
Yeah, it's interesting, like that you brought up the whole Marvin Gaye was going on aspect, and I just feel like it's kind of the same thing, but just a different generation, unfortunately. I do feel like as far as like that vigor and that fight, it's coming earlier in each generation. I feel like this next generation they're a lot more tuned into politics. They're more aware of social justice issues. Unfortunately, due to everything that's going on in this country, but I feel like they're a little bit more aware compared to like where I was when I was like, young. I wasn't really too aware of everything that's going on politically, but I feel like this next generation, unfortunately, has no choice but to be aware of what's going on because this is happening, so frequently and affecting them in so many different aspects. So I do feel like you're looking at like the Rodney King back in like back then. Now you hear like the George Floyd for this generation. Then you have the Trayvon Martin for my generation. So it's just like it's so many. It's like it's. I feel like it's just a similar situation but different generation. But I do feel like each generation is getting more and more educated, and I feel like that has to be the foundation for us to make change. So that's kind of how I see it.
Excellent. You know, the idea of zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, each generation has their own zeitgeist. But interestingly, we're seeing it cycle because clearly, when I was a child, watching the civil rights movement in the 60s and the way they were treating the people trying to cross the Pettus Bridge and all of that, put us in a mindset of social justice. And what you see is it cycled out when a lot of the leaders were co opted and took jobs in the mainstream and really kind of quieted down in terms of protest and that kind. And now it's cycling back, and it's going to keep cycling back, I believe, until we address it in a way that's effective. So thanks for that, Garrick. Robina?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Garrick said too. And something that I'm thinking is like the power of social media and how much of a influence it's had in the movement, especially when it comes to the younger generation. I think for a long time, what has been happening, and like also because of colonization, it's like Europeans and like colonizers have relied on us being one, like very divided and against each other. And I think more in recent years, like even I think 2019, the year of return, like people were really celebrating like African culture and excited about that. And so I think for, yeah, the younger generation, I feel like I see us being more like celebratory and appreciative of like our roots instead of, a lot of the bullying that we used to see when we were younger. I think we talked about this with Garrett too, like in the episode we did about across the diaspora. So like Black American, Caribbean American, all that. So that's one thing that I've noticed. And then because of social media, you see movements that are happening in other countries that are also in solidarity with us, or we're being in solidarity with them. But before, like when I was in elementary school or high school, I wasn't seeing this stuff that's going on in other countries, or I wasn't aware that other countries were experiencing some of the same like things like police brutality like we are. And so now I think it's a little bit easier to expose what's going on. I feel like now it's just a matter of um, all this is happening to expose it. And then the next step, like, what's the next generation going to do with all this information that we're kind of consuming right now? Even though it's very traumatic to be like seeing these things, I think part of it is happening to help us realize like this, this stuff is going on. And it's not somebody recently told me about the term like race sliding. Like it's not in our head, like it's actually happening, kind of like gaslighting, but how people are like, oh, you're always pulling the race card. But I think people more and more are seeing that these things are happening. And so we're kind of becoming more united and trying to figure out like how we can still be supportive of each other through the trauma.
Absolutely true. And I think the challenge is so we now become more aware that systemic racism is alive and well. But as Black psychologists, our concern is okay, so what is systemic racism and how does it affect us psychologically? How does it impact our mental health? And most importantly, what can we do to inoculate ourselves and eradicate it? And I think that's where I see the biggest challenge going forward in terms of future generations. Uh, who was it? It was, Carter G. Woodson, who said that if it won't do us any good to be able to say that more and more Black people have become educated since 1865, if the education they get is in service to our captors.
Mhm.
And one of our challenges is, and I have been a part of that generation, building Black studies and really trying to carve out space for a new academic orientation that really does allow us to ask the right questions. Africology asks not only different questions, but the right questions and tries to answer them from a culturally congruent frame of reference. And as we continue to pursue that, I think we have a chance. But if we don't, I am we don't have another generation to
Mm.
go on and on like this. I think we're kind of at the crossroads.
I think when you talk about the cycling and that, we keep going through the same cycles over and over, someone else once said that, people who don't know their own history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that, we keep repeating the lessons of history until we learn the lessons of history. And, so the question is, what can we do now to help um, um, promote that consciousness, that awareness that will allow us to know ourselves well enough to stop repeating this cycle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Linder. That you certainly nailed it in terms of it's about consciousness, isn't it? I think that we've learned from our experts, if we hadn't even read and studied for ourselves, that it's all about consciousness. Consciousness exists when we come into the world and when we leave the world. And so how it's shaped by our cultural um, patterns of interpreting reality and designs for living is really going to inform what our experience is going to be. And unfortunately, so many of us have only been exposed to one cultural frame, which is that of our ancestors' captors, that is designed not only to oppress and exploit Black people, but pretty much all people. The one percenter ideal is real, alive and well, and they control virtually the entire global society. So um, one of the things or one of the advantages of this particular time when things are being made plain for everybody to see is that we see it's all interdependent and all interconnected. And therefore, our solution has to arise from each individual and their capacity to really relate to their true selves.
Yeah,
I
something that you
spoke.
asked. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Linder. I was going to kind of
You
shift.
know, I would prefer it if you spoke, Ravina.
I was going to revisit one of the questions that you asked at the beginning, Nana Linda, where when you asked about maybe like lessons or things that we've kind of been learning through this time. And I think because we're still going through it and even like personal challenges and stuff on top of that, something that I think towards maybe like the end of last year became more comfortable with is even though there was so much mayhem going on, is the just like being able to lean into community and celebrating things that are happening, like good things that are happening. Like throughout the summer, sometimes I would feel bad. Like if something good is happening, I'm like, oh, that this kind of goes against, what everything else that's happening. The whole like, read the room type of situation. Like the world is like burning and Black people are experiencing so much that it almost felt insensitive to even think about some of the good things that were going on like in our lives. But yeah, I appreciate having like friends and even like, Jojo, Garrick, and Evan, like we had moments where we're doing like a lot of stuff, to help the Black community, or there's a lot of great things that are going on for us, in our academic, professional, and personal lives, and just finding ways to be able to celebrate Black joy. And I appreciated that conversation we had about like celebrating Black joy. I can't remember what month that was, but that was a pretty timely conversation that we had too.
And we have good reason to have joy.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to really get to that in a way that's not, doesn't feel selfish, but is feeling collective and inclusive, is I think the realization that all that's happening from a
All
particular
that's happening.
frame of reference in the wisdom tradition of African deep thought is part of a divine order. It's happening so that we can grow, master those lessons, and come to a higher consciousness, not just for ourselves individually, but collectively. So the challenge is before us.
Yeah, in the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, it's the saying is that all knowledge is self-knowledge. And so when I spoke of myself as an observer, I was not really thinking of myself as a disconnected observer, because you observe from within. And part of observing the world outside yourself is to begin with observing the world inside yourself, and how that self is connected to the world outside yourself.
I think the key there is getting to that true self, that multidimensional self. And that requires getting rid of ego. And unfortunately, in this social context, we are so immersed in ego. Oh my God, everything's about ego.
Everything's
You
about
got to look this way, you got to wear that, drive this car, get this education, get this degree. All of that is kind of building us up for a false sense of self that eventually is driving the white power structure, white supremacy, and it's also driving the economic elites to have greater control. And I think it's at that level of analysis that I sometimes shy away.
Well, do you think that sometimes that ego serves to be like protective in the midst of some of those things?
Depending on which ego you're talking about. If you're talking
Yeah.
about ego with the little e, it's got a good purpose. Its function is to help us grow. But if you're talking about ego with the capital E, oh, absolutely, it's protective and nurturing, and it's transcendent.
It does serve as a protection in the sense of counteracting all of the negative messages that we as African people get from the world around us, because we're bombarded day in and day out by messages that tell us we are less than, and we are, not as good as. And so to have some positive ego to help counteract that message is a positive thing. But I think that what Nana Linda was alluding to is that knowing the self beyond that is even more powerful than having a positive self-concept, positive ego self-concept to counteract those negative messages. If one really understands who you are and what you are, then you have a way of transcending all those negative messages.
And the trap is, it's if you've been socialized to build your sense of identity and worth on those successes, then it's hard to give them up, because that has been probably for you somewhat of a protective factor, even though at some point it fails by virtue of its nature of being finite and limited. So transcendence is almost the only path, the only path to higher consciousness, the only path to salvation, if you will.
So we have been acculturated to think of transcendence as something that's beyond us. And it isn't beyond us. It's something that we can all transcend into. But it takes unlearning a lot of the thinking that ways that you've learned to perceive the world, and ways that you've learned to perceive yourself, in order to allow yourself to go there and recognize that as the person you are, you can transcend all that's happening in the world around you, while being a part of all that's happening in the world around you.
Eric, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, no, that really like spoke to me, as far as because I usually thought like transcendence like usually like beyond you, but I guess what Dr. Leonard's kind of alluding to is that it could be beyond you and within you at the same time. So um yeah, it's just really interesting as far as like just conceptualizing, just really comprehending that idea, because I guess I only saw it in one aspect, but hearing it from a different perspective and a different lens, kind of like, that's interesting, you know. So it's little things like that. And I think um having conversations like this is so important because, you know, even just like for younger generation, like we kind of have like our view or perspective of what something is based off of just off of like, you know, our own experiences, things like that. When in reality, there can always be, you know, another way to look at it. Kind of going back to what I always keep like alluding to, like that conversation we had about like dichotomies versus diurnal thinking, and it really just changed like how I look at things, you know, in the sense of, you know, it could be both. It doesn't have to be just me looking outside, me transcending like outside of myself, but it could be within. So yeah, just like little things like that. It's just really interesting how you kind of just changes your perspective of life and like how you think. And yeah, just I was just it was just really interesting. So yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So good, because that diunital logic is foundational to an African centered worldview. It's never either or. And the idea that transcendence, if you have a multidimensional self, there's no way for transcendence to be outside of you. There's nowhere outside to be, because you are connected to all before all, which will come after, all of nature, all of community. And so, where would transcendence outside of you be? It would be an impossibility. So, good work.
That makes me think of spirit, and almost like also like in a conceptual way, but also like in a very like real way. Like when we think of like African spirituality and deep thought, I'm thinking about in some ways like the way that you described the ego part of us that is a little bit more destructive, not as you know, protective. I feel like if we have more spirit, or if we're leaning more into spirit and tapping into like what is connecting us, then it's less likely that we will end up being self-destructive, because a lot of it is like what word did you use about like how we've been socialized or programmed, and all those things like that can be unlearned through us actually tapping into our spirit.
Absolutely. The way for mastery to manifest has to be master the world's manifest by going within,
Yeah.
coming out.
The
So,
diurnal logic is something that you have to constantly practice seeing and practice being conscious of, you know, and asking yourself as you go through your day-to-day, you know, life, like, you know, we are so acculturated into dividing things into either or that we do it unconsciously. We don't think about the fact that we're dividing things into either or. And to remind ourselves, to ask ourselves, how is this diunital? How is this both and? You know, how can both and be occurring in this moment, in this time, with this, you know, event? You know, how is this? You know, how can I see the both sides of it at once? And you have to practice doing that to train your mind to do it, because your mind has been so trained to divide everything into either
either
or,
or.
one or the other.
But over time, it'll just become your way of thinking. How is this both true and not true at the same time?
Yeah, it's interesting. So even like with my friends, you know, I just have random conversations with my friends or whatever, and it's just like they give me like certain scenarios. I'm like, why can't it be both? Or like, you know, and it's just like, huh? Wow, like I never thought about it like that. And it's just like little things like that. I think asking certain questions can spark that idea of a different type of perspective. You know, like why can't it be both? Why does it have to be either or? Like something as simply just asking that, you can just get the wheels start turning in their heads. Like, maybe it can be both. Maybe you know, maybe it doesn't have. Maybe I don't have to choose between one or the other, and it's, you know, two parts of a whole. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So when we find ourselves looking at a problem or issue and it's either this or that, That's the perfect time to say, oh,
Just ask
how is
yourself.
it both this and that? How are both true at the same time? Practice makes perfect, they say.
I don't know how much of an audience we have today because I think people were not expecting us to be here today since we had said we were going to take a hiatus. But
They knew nothing about that.
We do
but
have a couple questions though.
Let's get to those questions.
but whether
Oh, go ahead,
people
Dr.
are with, oh, okay. I was going to say whether people are with us today or not, this is being recorded and people can come back and join in this thought process, because this is the reason we do this. It's to get people to join in the thought process, not just to listen to us and learn from us, but to think with us.
Let's get to our couple of questions.
All right. So actually, one of our ABPsi Student Circle Book Club buddies, Jerome, I'll talk about the book club at the end, asked, how might we create social spaces that embody transcendence and true ego with a capital E? And then he said, this is a deep well kindergarten for adults.
That's such a good question. And I think the key is, let me back up a bit. He's asking about how we create social space, right? Was that his question?
Correct. Yeah, social
So
space.
I think one strategy and key is when you are there yourself, then you carry that wherever you go. And because energy is not demarcated like we think, you'll bring that energy wherever you go, and you'll start attracting people who are attracted to that energy, and it becomes cumulative and grows in that kind of way. But I think, as we were suggesting before with transcendence in general, got to start within and work on yourself, getting beyond your individual ego to a place where what really identifies you is that spiritual aspect of being. And from there, you can get in touch with Zola, that love and tranquility and peace and productivity that allow you to connect with the Ngola, as we would say, which is the healing energy. And so immersing yourself in that space, as to the extent you carry it with you wherever you go, I think allows others to pick it up, and it magnifies. And what he's raised is exactly what we've got to do. That's our solution.
And part of the answer to his question is, it's not so much a matter of creating that space, but recognizing that that space is there. So it's becoming conscious of the space, not really creating the space, because all that's, all the space that's going to be created has been created essentially. I mean, so it's a matter of well, yeah, I get all tongue tied when I think about it. It's not so much a matter of like creating a special space as that's outside of you, but creating a consciousness in your mind that makes you aware of that space and makes you aware of your being in that space at all times.
There was a quote. I just had to Google because I didn't want to mess it up. But it was saying, knowing others is intelligence, but knowing yourself is true wisdom, and mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself is true power. And I think talking about, transcendence and that aspect kind of like it's kind of like showing you like, there's power and strength, with doing what you can to others, but it's the power is stronger, or that strength is stronger when you're able to master, yourself and internally. I feel like when you're able to do that internally, be able to like, I guess, exude that to other people and, get other people to think, what can I do by myself? And that energy will be exuded and, permeates other people's, thought processes. So yeah, like, I don't know, like that was really interesting to me. Like it was saying like, mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself is true power. I'm just like, really spoke to me.
So that dichotomy between Western thought and African thought is so clear as you begin to pursue self-knowledge, because we've all been immersed in a social context that's always concerned with power over others,
Mhm.
seldom concerned with power over oneself.
And
And
why
ultimately,
would you want to
systemic
master
racism
others?
isn't going to be addressed until we get that power over ourselves.
And why would you want to master others? The real challenge is mastering yourself. The biggest challenge you'll ever face is mastering yourself.
Greed and materialism seem to be the primary motivators in this social context. I mean, if you look at the way the society's structured at every level, it's about power over getting people to buy things they don't need. We can pinpoint in history when what is this? Freud's nephew came back from World War I and thought he could teach the business people how to use the same practices from brainwashing in war to get people to buy things they don't need rather and make them want them. And that was a big, I mean, he's the father of marketing. So there are people who have been looking at this for a long time and making big money, but that's not our agenda. Our agenda is to liberate the mind and illuminate the soul and elevate the consciousness.
Rabina, you said there were a couple of other questions out there?
Yeah, I realized some of them were more so like thought-provoking comments, which I can share as well. But real
We
quick,
like thought-provoking comments.
somebody asked about where they could read more about diurnal logic. So Nana Linda, I'm wondering if you have like a reference that you would prefer I
Yes,
put
I
in
happen to have this book. So my introduction to optimal psychology, understanding the Afrocentric worldview, is basically a thought piece that builds on how to begin to see the world through this African-centered idea. And it's coming from some of the work done by Edwin Nichols, who looks at all cultural groups and their cultural frame. But what fascinated me was how African people were able to survive uh, almost 4 centuries of dehumanization. So in that book, I outline the differences between the cultural worldview we've been missocialized into, which I call suboptimal, and the cultural worldview of the wisdom tradition, which I refer to as optimal. And so that would be a good starting place.
Okay, I'll put that in the chat for them. And then I'll read this one comment from Bakari. They said, the next step is to hopefully direct more time, energy, and resources in widespread collective independent cultural institution building. Be African centered and more proactively focused instead of continually reactive. Eliminate the generational cycle of anti-Africanism with nurturing, supportive, and self-healing cultural practices like Zola. And then they said the conversation is
We
great.
definitely need our own institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully, as all these people who are business folk dropping all this money in the Black community, hopefully somebody's getting some of that money to build our own institutions and our own educational system, so we have the opportunity to really immerse people all the way from birth on to another way of seeing and being in the world.
I was actually having this conversation the other day about like, you know, the like raising children in this world and the differences that might come with like if the child is raised in like, let's say like a public school setting, which, you know, we know is geared towards like our miseducation. And then there's a lot, you know, these white people who send their kids to Catholic schools or Jewish people send their kids to Jewish schools, and nobody ever really, you know, says anything about that. But if we want to send our kids to like African-centered or Afrocentric schools or HBCUs, there's a lot of criticism around, well, what kind of education are you getting? You know, is it well-rounded? And I know like Baba Naeem writes about this as well in the book Know Thyself, but I'm just kind of wondering like what that could look like in the world as we're moving forward if we're actually are sending Black kids to like African-centered schools. Yeah.
It would be transformative, but I think our challenge is to find African-centered teachers. So you can't have an African-centered school. I know in Columbus, Ohio, we had an African-centered school, public school, but the principals that currently exist are not African-centered. They don't even believe in African-centered education. And so I think the challenge is to find adults, potential teachers, leaders who have a commitment to African-centered thought and African-centered practice so that they do create an educational environment where the kids get something other than a Blackanized version of mainstream.
What we, what our task is as Black psychologists, as African-centered psychologists, is to figure out how to create this cadre of African-centered thinkers who can then go out and define, then can can define what needs to be in a curriculum of an African-centered school. What is the thought that needs to be taught in those schools? Um, there aren't many institutions that are around that can deliver that kind of thinking process in order to build a set of schools around. And we have, our task is to begin to create that within, our cadre of Black psychologists who are people who are motivated to want to do that. I think we have a lot of people who are motivated to want to do it. I'm not sure how many people we have who actually have the consciousness to bring it up, to carry it off.
You know, one of the things I do know is that for the past at least 4 decades, people have been very committed to building African-centered curriculum.
Mhm.
So it's not like the curriculum doesn't exist. I think what you are speaking to, Elder Linder, is we need people who want to have a commitment to take that curriculum and create institutional structures around it to support it. And it's a challenge because we know that racism has three manifestations: systemic, personal, and internalized racism. And I think one of our biggest challenges is that we have a lot of people who have internalized oppression, internalized racism, and therefore they reject the idea that there could be any kind of greater good to anything Black or African centered, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, it's like the systemic part is I feel like it's the biggest challenge in regards to trying to disseminate the information. Like, this kind of information isn't typically taught in schools, and the reasons why that, because I guess like the Board of Education, I guess people who design the curriculum don't feel like it's important to be taught. And just talking about, this really isn't bashing like schools or anything, but just the curriculum in general with schooling, nowadays. And kids aren't taught about mental health. Kids aren't, we aren't taught about, how to about financial literacy. It's typically just designed to just, box you in. I feel like if we were taught certain things that would, really empower us to do something. And I feel like that is the biggest thing in regards to how we navigate these times. I feel like they don't want to empower us too much, because if we are empowered too much, they're afraid something can happen, is rooted in that fear aspect. But despite all that occurring, I feel like, we have to do what we have to do as far as using our platforms, having creators on Mondays, doing our work in ABPsi, doing our work within our field to really just, empower each other individually. Because I feel like it's gonna be a while for us to really hope for the system to really take hold onto this type of education. So I feel like we have to do our part to create our own system by educating each other. And I feel like by then enough people would know this type of thinking and hopefully elevate their consciousness.
And part of the challenge is that almost all of us, well, all of us, have learned um, that the way of imparting knowledge is is this methodology that we've learned in Western culture, that you have people who teach you facts and give you additional knowledge, and you begin to internalize that the way to become more knowledgeable, more intelligent, is to learn additional facts. And I don't think that was really the methodology of teaching, you know, in the African-centered framework. You know, the methodology of teaching was to evoke you to think, and uh, not give you facts, but evoke you to think in a way that you would search for the knowledge yourself, and you would understand the knowledge, you know, in a different way because you had found that knowledge yourself. And
Well, so
part of
critical
part
thinking.
of discovering that knowledge is discovering yourself.
Yeah, I really like that. I think you kind of like hit the hammer on the nail in regards to westernized type of teaching, which is like facts, learn this, versus I guess the African centered thinking is really just challenge you to think, you know, not really imparting their type of perspective onto you, but you know, asking these questions, you know, kind of like what I alluded to when the conversation with like my friends, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know, can it be both, you know, versus the whole diurnal example, you know, really just ask them, you know, really asking questions to get their wheels turning and have them create their own kind of perspective. And then you can have these kind of these debates, these arguments, these kind of discussions in regards to, you know, why you came to these kind of conclusions. I really like the aspect of evoking thought, because I think that's where creativity can be really cultivated. I think that's where freedom can also be cultivated. But I feel like, you know, that would be a more optimal kind of way of teaching. But unfortunately, you know, it's the opposite in regards to how we're taught in schools.
Well, you can't have power over people if you teach them to think and think critically
Exactly.
and think deeply. You got to keep giving them the information. Don't think. So that's the way the system's been built. But now that we know that's the way it's built, we have to reject it and begin to think for ourselves and create that which we think.
Well, you know, one of the reasons that they don't teach students to become critical thinkers is that critical thinkers will then begin to criticize the people who are teaching them, and and that's not, you know, met with acceptance. But I mean, the reality is, if you want to create critical thinkers, they are going to criticize what you're teaching them.
And that should be welcome because that's their growth and it's your growth and it's our growth. Hey, Jojo, welcome.
Yeah, I think like that's the challenge.
I'm
I
joking.
think in the sense of, you know, having, I feel like and that's more I think that's more like personal in regards to, you know, those teachers being challenged, you know, or being welcomed or open to that challenge. Like, listen, I want you to challenge me in the sense of not being offended or intimidated or disrespected, but wow, the fact that you have this kind of idea, you know, and you're criticizing this and you're thinking something differently, you know, I welcome that, versus the way we're in school is just like if you try to criticize or even ask questions against the norm,
Mhm.
it's looked as being disrespectful
There
or
goes
wrong
your A.
or rude. Yeah.
Right. And you know, we're trying to teach the younger generation that it's very important to respect their elders, and it's very important to respect those who have gone before. Um, and so there's a reverence that gets in the way of challenging the thought process that our elders have, and that you know, those who have gone before. Knowledge progresses in a series of steps. It's like a spiral going up, and so the fact that uh, you want to add to that knowledge and you want to push it beyond the boundaries of where your elders were doesn't it doesn't it's not a knock against the elders. You know, it's just saying, okay, they got us to this level, let's take us to the next level. And then your students are going to come along and they're going to take what they learned from you and take that to another level beyond what you taught them.
So
And
then
then
you have the other side of that, which is the both and.
Mhm.
Nothing's new under the sun. Nothing is new under the sun. So the idea that you're talking about, Elder Harvey, to me is more about ego, which is where we started about 40 minutes ago. As a teacher, as an elder, if I have matured and transcended within me, then I'm not troubled by a younger person or any other person questioning or challenging or sharing their perspective. I embrace it. I say, thank you. I'm so happy. I can leave now. I know things are going to be good.
like,
So
you
it's a
take the
shift.
baton, you go, right?
It's a shift. And I think that shift really has to do more with ego. When
Mhm.
my ego's in check, when I know who I really am, whatever you ask me is fine. Whatever development you make is wonderful. In fact, as I move to the realm of the elder and ancestor, that's my expectation, particularly from the ancestral realm. I'm not expecting people to do exactly what I did. I'm expecting people to do greater, greater than this ye shall do, has
Mhm.
been the teaching in the wisdom tradition.
That just really made something that I read last week make sense, because it was from Dr. Late Elder Dr. Wright's book, The Psychopathic Racial Personality. He talks about having like systems and Black folks that could also like surround us when we're having like African-centered education and stuff like that, and having like a theory to support us. And I think that your theory like lends to that. But what you said about it's not um, something about your ego, in my mind I'm thinking, because it's not about you, it's about like us as a whole, it's about like our people, it's about liberation. So when we allow our ego to get in the way of getting like critical or constructive feedback in those kinds of ways, it's almost like we are enabling the system to kind of continue, because the system is set up for us to just not think. It's just set up for us to be programmed and to move in this very robotic way that doesn't challenge anything, or that doesn't allow space for us to be who we're meant to be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Each of us has our own contribution to make, don't we?
Mhm.
We're here and nobody's going to make your contribution but you, because that's why you're here representing, to do that. And so if we can get and shift out of that suboptimal mindset we've been so immersed in and come to a realization that our worth is intrinsic, all knowledge is within, and that I am here for a purpose, and my purpose has to be fulfilled out of my own desire and creativity to share and create community and to transform. Then we don't have time for all that nonsense we've been missocialized into, and we realize it's really a detractor, a distraction that keeps us from coming to our greatest and highest good.
Do we have time for a question from
We
the
do.
audience? Okay. So we talked about like the divine feminine energy before, and I feel like the men that we have here are might be exceptions to this question in a way. But so the question says, I feel like Black women have understood this passing of the baton from nurturing and mothering. How do men see it?
Oh, do me and Garrick have to answer that?
See, you're the man.
I'm too young to know, so I'll pass it to Garrick.
Repeat that question one more time.
So Black women have understood this passing of the baton from nurturing and mothering. How do men see it? I guess, how do men see the passing of the baton when it comes to this kind of conversation, or like what we've talked about?
As far as like women empowerment and all that stuff.
I'm thinking it kind of has to do with what we talked about, like ego, transcendence,
I don't know.
liberation.
I still feel like women still have that nurturing. Like going back to are you trying to say like women don't have that anymore? I'm confused because I still believe women are still nurturing and
No, I don't think they're saying that women don't have it.
But I don't think it's just about nurturing. Um, Passing the baton to the next generation is about passing on all your survival skills to the next generation. And men may have developed different survival skills than women have developed, but we all give what we have. And the idea is to develop a degree of we'll call it selflessness, so that it's not about you. It's no longer about you. It's about the next generation and the next generation after that and the next generation after that. And you pass on whatever you have learned and whatever you have accomplished and whatever you have accumulated to allow those who come behind you to then be able to advance beyond wherever you were. And men and women may do those things in different ways, but to me, that's fine. That men and women don't have to be the same to be equal.
So one of the things that I think is important for us to understand, the divine feminine is the manifestation of truth, justice, and righteousness. Ma'at is truth, justice, and righteousness. That is the divine feminine, and therefore it's not limited just to women. It's human beings have the capacity for manifesting the divine feminine. And I think from that, it also helps us to see that, we've been talking about passing the baton and this kind of thing. There is a cultural worldview that we're all aspiring to, where we realize that idea of passing on is kind of a misnomer. If we are indeed one, all is one, then rather than passing on, I'm thinking maybe we should be thinking about the continual infusion of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding as opposed to passing it on. Because all knowledge is within you now. All your challenge, our challenge, my challenge is to chip away all that nonsense that I've been given so I can see my divinity and realize it. It's there now. It's nothing somebody passed on to me or I'm going to pass on. What I want to pass on, hopefully, is the capacity to help people understand it's already there. You already are divine. You came that way. Now, how can we chip away at all this nonsense and this white supremacist control over economic exploitation mess so we can see it, so we can kind of feel it and come to realize it? And so just like we've talked about the diunital logic and different understandings of self and self-knowledge, there's so much more that we need to pursue and grasp so that we can clean up the mess that has us on the brink or has humanity on the brink of destruction. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now and see if anybody else has anything to say.
I just want to add that I definitely agree with Dr. Linda in regards to, just, I guess, passing on the wisdom that you've learned. I think in regards to just moving forward, you need to learn from those mistakes, but take away from those, take away, I guess, the gems and the successes that person before you received, but also the mistakes, so you don't have to repeat that. Going back to like what we were saying in the past, as far as like the reason why we keep seeing this generation of generations, because we're not learning from the instances before. So I really think just hopping on that is really just it's wisdom. I think that goes back to like being wise and just understanding yourself and understanding like what or what you've learned, really filter all the negative and I guess the westernized thinking, and then present that to the next generation that's a little bit more raw and a little bit more cleaner in regards to that kind of knowledge and information. Because, huh?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, but that was really it.
No, I was just thinking lessons in the season of challenges. And then there'll be a point when we come to realize we are the next generation. We are the ancestors. But that's for part two. No, seriously, thank you so. And that was serious because it's so much we have to unlearn and relearn. But thank you so much for tuning in, and we will be back on the third Wednesday, Monday of the month, and then we're going to take a brief hiatus. So come back with your comments and questions as we continue this conversation on lessons learned from the season of challenges. Thanks so much for joining. Peace and blessings. Much love. Zola up. All that stuff.